Hey, welcome to another Front-End Engineering Explained. So this one's a little different. So I'm thinking of making these videos where I like read some blog posts and stuff. This might not be the format it takes exactly, but this is a super interesting one. So this started when a colleague of mine at Factorial shared a link to this post on our working group, our front-end working group. And I opened it, I started reading it, and then I started looking into it more and more. And the deeper down this rabbit hole you go, the more interesting it gets. So I thought I'd just turn on the camera and show some of the stuff that's happening in here. So it's all about the dialogue element. So what Simon wanted to do here is essentially open a dialogue, have it coming from the side, but it being the full height of the viewport. So, you would think like block size 100%, something like that, or maybe even block size 100 VH, like viewport units, viewport height, right? But what he found was, you can see here, for example, he's even using viewport height here, right? But you can see that there's this space down here, even though, he's using that. And so he asked the question, where the heck does the gap come from? He was using Firefox and looking there, he couldn't see, so he went to the Claudes and the GPTs and the Geminis and nothing. And then Natalie, I'm guessing, yeah, this is a colleague, I would say, or maybe Natalie down. So she showed him some, or pity me, and stepped in to help. Suspicion was that this had something to do with the dialogue element. So rewrote it to use a div, and problem went away. So he was using Firefox and he couldn't see the browser styles. You can actually, he has a thingy at the bottom. Where is it? So it's just hidden by default, so you can turn it on. But anyways, then looking in the CSS, he saw this interesting thing here, which is these two lines, which is the default browser styles. And so it sets the max width to calc 100% minus 2em minus 6 pixels, and it does the same thing for the height. So with this, the maximum height that this dialog can ever be is 100%, but minus, these two values. And it's like, okay, what's the deal? So he basically just like set max height to none or max height 100 VH and problem fixed. But as I did, he also went further down and further down, and he like looked into this. Where's this? In the WG HTML, looked through that, found these lines in there, found some more stuff, and then found a commit message. And then this is where I went to. I went to the commit message, which is over here. And you can see here it is. But here's an interesting little bit, which is 6 pixels plus 2em, which is border plus padding. So interesting. Now here Fantasy says, I don't think this is going to cascade well. If the author changes the border width at all, it'll be wrong, right? You should use stretch keyword here, and we'll get to that. Then basically BF Geek says, blah, 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 change preemptively to stretch. Then Anna came in and said, well, don't know if you've seen, but actually no browser has implemented stretch. Firefox might eventually, all these kinds of things. So now the conversation continues. Are we going to block dialogue because of this? Anna is saying, this is back in 2020, by the way. I don't think Firefox will block on stretch. And so they were talking about, we don't have stretch. Let's see here. So Blink Engineer. We don't have stretch, but we could use WebKit fill available. that we'll get to as well, which they are moving more and more closer to being stretch. However, they're also happy to keep this. So then Dominic again says, well, there's interop things here and there's compat things. So if one uses this and the other one uses calc, it's not exactly the same. Also, how easy will it be in future to switch to stretch? If both uses calc, also that might prevent from ever upgrading to stretch. So now we're matching trade-offs against one another. So depending, what do we prioritize? Do we prioritize interop or do we prioritize compat? And then there's a third concern. So the conversation went on, and this was then Emilio came in, who's a Gecko hacker, so meaning Firefox, says we could probably use Moz available. But he said, or they said that wouldn't be too hard to either hook that or implement stretch. So eventually, like, we should use stretch, but nobody's implemented that yet, and we don't want to block Dialog on that. So we ended up with this, but there's the more interesting things here. And so this kind of had the origin, and I haven't really dug into this part yet, but here is some backstory on why these default user styles exist. So I'm going to kind of just read this. So Chromium engineer Ian Kilpatrick dropped a fascinating comment on Hacker News explaining the backstory for the max-height default rule. So there's quite a bit of history here, but the abbreviated version is that the dialog element was originally added as a replacement for window.alert. And there were libraries polyfilling dialog and being surprisingly widely used. Smooshgate, ask your local GPT or Claude about Smooshgate, or just do a search. That'll get you the answer too. The mechanism which Dialog was originally positioned was relatively complex and slightly hacky, magic values for the insets. Changing the behavior basically meant that we had to add overflow auto and some form of max height, max width to ensure that the content within the dialog was actually reachable. So essentially that stuff doesn't blow outside of the viewport of the browser. The better solution to this was to add max height stretch, max width stretch, and then there's a whole discussion here, which might be the one that I was just looking at. Yes, that's the whole discussion there. I'll close that one down. Where were we now? There we go. The problem is that no browser had and still shipped stretch. Blink likely will soon, and we'll look at that in a second. So Blink is the rendering engine, the HTML rendering engine underneath Chromium. However, this was pushed back against as this had to go in the specification. Nobody wanted to implement it. WebKit full available would have been an acceptable substitute in Blink, but other browsers didn't have this working the same yet. Hence the calc variant. So, long story, but there's this little detail here that I'll get into in a second. I just want to move this little thing out the way. There we go. So essentially this calc is to ensure that all the content is inside the viewport. So hence the calc variant, primarily because box sizing content box being the default and pre-existing border padding styles on Dialog that we didn't want to touch. Understandably so. So we'll look at all of these things in a second. So in just generally, let me think where the most likely... So let me go back here. Here's another little interesting discussion. So here, this line was removed, but it says, maybe let's just see here, set the is modal flag of subject to true. Set the dialog to the center alignment mode, and then this was removed. And so Dominic said, so is this intentionally really that show and show modal now have the same visual behavior? That's a bit surprising because, but if it's what everyone wants, because you may not know, or you may know, but the dialog element, the way you show it, has two possible ways. The one is called .show, and the other is .show modal. As the name suggests, show modal will open the dialog in modal mode, which means like it has the backdrop, but also it makes everything at the back inert. It doesn't have light dismiss by default. If you call show, it's different in that you can still interact with the content behind the modal. So the stuff behind it isn't inert. So then, yeah, this is a bit surprising to me too. I was under the impression that all discussions happened around we were targeting centered alignment mode. It makes sense for show modal to use position fixed, but I wouldn't expect that behavior when calling show. At risk of it ending up back in the CSS working group, it feels like it would make sense to do something like this. So this person, Daryl, let's see where he's from. Vancouver software developer and web fanatic. So when it's a dialog, use position absolute. When it's dialog modal, hypothetical pseudo class that does not currently exist, use position fixed. So how we're positioning this changes. And then here, PFG comes in. Okay, thoughts on the above. I'd be happy with the above proposal where the applied CSS would be. And here we can say position fixed, overflow auto, our insets, and then again, this coming back to ensure that we keep all the content reachable, i.e. visible in the viewport. And then here I agree, make the dialog to be absolute and the modal dialog to be fixed. Looks much safer. Okay, so here's a lot going on here, right? Now if we just dive into here, so links intend to ship stretch. So what stretch says is it behaves as 100%, except it sizes the margin box regardless of the value of box sizing. Now we'll see what exactly that would mean in a second. Okay, so let's inspect a couple of things. So I have a very, very simple example here, and we're going to play around with it a little bit. So I just have a button, which is going to be the trigger to open the dialog, and we just have a dialog that has a little P sign in there. I'm going to comment this out. So now we're in the world of box sizing content box, which is the default. And I'm also going to comment this out. And we're setting our block size and our inline size to 100%. We could use viewport units as well. So let's do block size. So that's viewport height, viewport width. So we're saying make it full screen, right? Take up the entire screen with the dialog when it's open. And then just a little bit of JavaScript here. You know, just grab the things, and when you click on the button, which you can't see not right now, but you'll see in a second. Right now, I'm calling show modal. Okay, so if we run this, okay, and we open our dialog, we can see here that it's full width. I mean, it might be a little hard to see. That's why I'll turn on the hot pink border in a second. But essentially, we have our border that's right up to the edges, and all our content is still in here. Now, if we call show, so not modal, right? You see there's a slight difference here, and that is because of the position fixed versus position absolute. So now if we click, you might say, what's the difference? If you scroll up, that's the difference. Also, you can see we have scroll bars now. Okay, so this is because the one is positioned absolute, the other one's positioned fixed. Okay, so that's the one thing that's interesting that you may or may not have known, that's one of the other differences. Now let's go back to show modal. Show modal, run. Okay, now I'm going to turn on the 3-pixel hot pink just so it's easier to see. Okay, so now we can see again, we're flush. You can see our borders right up there. Now, what happens with content box? So with content box, this is the default and how things we used to, if you develop back in the day, you know how much one would fight with these kinds of things. Because With content box, the width and height properties include the content, but does not include the padding, border, or margin. So, for example, if you have a box and you're saying that box should be 350 pixels, but then you add a 10 pixel border, now all of a sudden your box is 370 pixels because it takes the content of 350 and it adds the border. So the content 350 doesn't shrink to accommodate the border, it just makes the box bigger. With border box, your width and height properties include the content, padding, and border, but they do not include the margin. So now if you have a box and you say my box should be 350 but also have a 10 pixel border, the box is still 350, right? So that is the difference between the two. Now the default is that is the content box, right? Now if we now make the border, and if we go back to the comment over here by Fantasy, who said, I don't think this is going to cascade well. If the author changes the border width at all, it'll be wrong, right? So if we say 6, so we double up the border, and now we run, you can see there what Fantasy said, right? So our border in here, so now we have this unreachable content, right? So our border on the left looks good, but at the top and the bottom it's cut off clearly, and on the right hand side, in fact, we can't see the border at all. So let's switch this back to 3. And of course, same deal with padding. Like padding will also start blowing things out. So padding, let's say 4M, right? Let's run and then open it up. Boop, you can see here, right? Like you can only see a thin slither there because remember this dialog is getting bigger. It's subtracting 2M, but we're adding another 2M back. So you can see how this kind of is problematic. But now this, if you ever run into this, you will understand why this is happening. Now I'm going to comment that out. But now let me show you something interesting. Actually, let me turn on. So I'm going to turn on border box, right? And let's run it again. Now, if we go back to this comment here, which says, is the intention really that show modal have the same visual behavior, blah, 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 blah. And that is the whole center alignment thing. So right now you would have seen when I use show, it like sits below the trigger, like position absolute. But when we are doing show modal, depending on how you look at this, it's not center. Like right now, it just takes up the entire screen, which probably is what you want, and which is definitely what Simon wanted. But now you'll see what's happening. So let me just make sure that I've run the latest. Okay, so now we click. Aha! Now we see that centered alignment that's mentioned here. Now you can see it has this margin around it, and it's exactly in the center. And if we add our padding of 4M, which is double what's being, everything is still cool because you can see the little hand is moved in because the content box is now accommodating the additional padding we've added. We can also go all the way to like 12 pixels. By the way, I'm using the same units that they use just so it's easier to understand. And our layout is still good. But here's something even that I found even more interesting. And if we inspect our dialog here and we go down, here's that thing. Because remember, as I mentioned, the modal pseudo doesn't exist. So they're using this thing called internal dialog in top layer. And here you can see as those two rules. But if we look at something over here, we'll see something really interesting also. So here now is a 19 pixel margin around it. See that? Okay. Now if I go here and I turn off box sizing, Now, look what happens here. We have this negative 57 margin over here, negative blah, blah, blah over here. That is interesting all in itself. But if we restore, if I now comment this out and I restore this to the 3 pixels, also they are, let me just open it really quick. Dialog. Also, they are subtracting 6 pixels. Yeah, because it's 3 pixels on one side, 3 pixels on the other side, and 3 pixels at the top, 3 pixels at the bottom. So it's 6 pixels from each side, right? And you can see the padding is 16. And generally your 1 rem or 1 m is equal to 16. So 2m would be 16 plus 16. Also 16 plus 16 for our block start and block end. So, but now we can see our 19 pixel margin is back. So if I now turn off border box, our margin is just gone, right? What is this? Like for a second I was like, huh? What? What's happening to it? Also 19, that's odd. Well, 16 plus 3 is 19. And we're now in border box mode. So remember when we read here, it says the width and height properties include content, padding, and border, but do not include margin, right? So our margin is retained, which is giving us this center alignment. But when we now switch to content box, now our two things. We're going to get to 2 things here. With content box, the width and height properties include content, but does not include padding, border, and margin. Cool. So we do that. Boop. Boop. Okay. Now, what else is happening here? So if we go back to stretch, if we go back to stretch, so stretch would do the following. It behaves like 100%, except it sizes the margin box regardless of the value of box sizing, right? So our margin box. So what's happening here is when I set box sizing to border box, we're excluding that margin, so we're getting that margin around the edges. When I go back to content box, we're losing that, and it's because we've said that the max width and max height should be, there's something else. Sorry, I'm getting a little lost here, but here's the other interesting thing here. Width and height should be fit content. Okay, so what does fit content do? So if we go here, the fit content keyword is equivalent to fit content stretch. In practice, this means that the box will use the available space, but never more than max content, right? So we're setting the width and height to fit content, but then we're also giving it a max width and height. And right here, we're compensating with that 2m and 6 pixels. So essentially what's happening when we turn on this, we're getting our margins, because margins is not now being included inside our element, inside our dialog. But when we turn this box sizing off, we're losing the margin because it needs to fit it into our available space. And our max width and height is constraining it to make sure it's inside the viewport, that it's all the content inside this dialog is reachable. Whoa, that is a lot that's going on here. So I hope this made sense. You might have to watch it more than once. I don't know. But I find it fascinating, and also it gives you a little glimpse behind the complexity that exists in implementing these standards. And it gives you some more, if you needed more reason to really be appreciative of the work that's being done by people who not only define these standards, but then the browser engineers who has to implement these things, and then work across companies that often have competing priorities and competing products even, to make these things work the way they do. It's actually kind of a magic trick in a way. It's actually amazing that it works as well as it does. So I think what this also highlights is there's some things here that maybe could aid in debugging in future if you see that your dialog or something is behaving strangely. And the interesting thing is, Simon would most likely not have run into that problem, but these days almost every site or every project that we build will have some kind of CSS reset, and even though those have shrunk greatly, we would find that more often than not, that CSS reset would include something like this, which would basically ensure that everything, every kind of element, pseudo element, everything that you create has the box sizing of border box set. And with that set, we're going to run into this max height here, right? Which is what Simon ran into. So I don't know. This was like almost 27 minutes of rambling through all of this. I found this fascinating. I'm really glad that Fynn Ellie shared this. And yeah, I'd love to hear your comments. Have you been bitten by this? Does this answer some of the questions you might have like been pulling your hair out of? By the way, this also sits on this thing called the top layer. That's a whole thing in itself. I don't know where it's showing it to me now. Usually you can see the top layer here. Oh, but it's probably, here we go. So our dialog actually sits here and has a little backdrop. And by the way, you can click on these things and it'll show you where they actually are. So just another neat trick that I saw when I looked at another article today. But I hope you found this interesting. I surely found this fascinating and like gave me just even more appreciation for web standards and all the work that goes into it. And if something behaves differently than you're expecting, maybe sometimes we need to dig into the history of why things are the way they are and look at the default browser styles and see if there's something there that's interesting but also helps us solve the bug that we're facing. Anyway, as the little hand there shows, peace and make the web awesome, and I'll speak to you soon.